June 4, 1942, 1400 hours. The bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu, 150 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, is staring at a reconnaissance report he cannot reconcile with what his own pilots told him 3 hours ago. Around midday, 18 dive bombers from Hiryu had attacked an American carrier. They reported 3 direct bomb hits. They reported fires consuming the flight deck. They reported heavy smoke trailing behind the ship as she slowed and listed. The pilots came back to Hiryu and told Yamaguchi the American carrier was finished. She was burning and dead in the water. 3 hours later, the scout plane shadowing the American fleet sends back a new sighting report. It describes an American carrier at full speed, launching fighters, with no visible damage, no smoke, no list, no fire. Yamaguchi reads the report. The admiral's face does not change. He issues the order to prepare a second strike, this time with torpedo bombers. He does not say what every officer on the bridge is thinking. He does not need to. The question is already hanging in the air between all of them. How is that ship still alive? The torpedo bombers launch. They fly toward the American fleet. When they arrive, they see a carrier steaming at nearly 20 knots with a clean flight deck and fighters in the air. The Japanese pilots attack what they believe is a second, undamaged American carrier. They do not know, and will not learn until long after the battle is over, that they are looking at the same ship. The carrier their dive bombers set on fire around noon is the carrier their torpedo bombers are attacking around 1440. The Americans have put out every fire, patched the flight deck, relit the boilers, and gotten the ship back up to speed. In 3 hours. The ship is USS Yorktown, and the reason she is still alive, the reason the Japanese cannot kill her with 3 bombs and will need 2 aerial torpedoes and a submarine attack over 2 more days to finally sink her, is not luck. It is not superior armor. It is not a single brilliant officer giving a single brilliant order. It is something the Imperial Japanese Navy has no doctrinal category for, no training manual to explain, and no cultural framework to understand. It is 1,200 American sailors, from the engine rooms to the flight deck, every one of them fighting fires and shoring bulkheads and sealing compartments and pumping water, not because they were ordered to, but because they knew how. Because every man on that ship had been trained, drilled, and culturally prepared to keep his ship alive. And that, in the end, is the difference that sank the Japanese Navy. To understand why a Japanese admiral in the Pacific was staring at a sighting report and asking how an American carrier could still be fighting, we need to go back not to Pearl Harbor, not even to the 1930s. We need to go back to a stretch of grey water in the North Sea in 1916, and to a single afternoon off the coast of Denmark that would quietly decide what happened to Yorktown 26 years later. This is the story of how the United States Navy learned to keep its ships alive using lessons the Japanese Navy had every opportunity to learn and chose to ignore, and of how, in the end, the nation that built the most powerful striking fleet in the Pacific watched the nation it had dismissed as soft and undisciplined do something it could never replicate. The Americans refused to let their ships die, and the Japanese never understood why. We have to begin with a sentence that sounds like it belongs in a different war. The damage control system that saved American carriers in the Pacific was, in its origins, a German idea. May 31, 1916. The Battle of Jutland. The largest naval engagement of the First World War. The British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet meet in the North Sea, off the coast of Denmark. By the time the guns fall silent, 14 British ships and 11 German ships have been sunk. The British lose more tonnage, more men, and more capital ships. But the detail that will quietly reshape naval architecture for the next century is not who won, it is who survived. The German battlecruiser SMS Seydlitz absorbs 21 heavy shell hits at Jutland. She takes a torpedo. She ships over 5,300 tons of seawater. Her forward compartments flood until her bow is nearly awash. By every reasonable calculation, she should be on the bottom of the North Sea. She is not. Her crew keeps her afloat. Her watertight subdivision holds. Her damage control parties seal compartment after compartment, pump water, shore bulkheads, and bring her limping back to port. She will fight again. She is not the only example. The battlecruiser SMS Derflinger takes 17 major caliber hits and survives. The battleship SMS Koenig takes 10 heavy caliber hits and keeps her station in the battle line. Across the German formation, ship after ship absorbs punishment that sinks British vessels of comparable size and remains afloat. The British, whose own ships are blowing apart from magazine explosions, lose 3 battlecruisers in a single afternoon. The Germans lose none to that cause. The difference is not armor alone, it is organization. German damage control parties are trained, drilled, and assigned to specific areas of the ship. They know their compartments, they know their valves, they know their pumps. When a shell comes through the hull, they do not wait for orders, they act. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, take careful notice. After the war, when the United States Navy gains access to German naval records and German ship designs, the Bureau of Construction and Repair studies the German damage control system with intense interest. The Germans had built their warships around a principle that the Americans will adopt as their own. The principle was simple: damage in battle is inevitable. What matters is not whether your ship gets hit, what matters is whether your ship survives being hit. The Germans had codified this in a document called the Leckregeln, their damage control regulations, which stated plainly that the control of damage in battle supersedes all other requirements. According to General Board records studied by naval historians, a translated copy of those German regulations was furnished to American capital ships. Naval architects in Washington began redesigning American warships with deeper watertight subdivision, better cross-flooding systems, and more organized damage control parties. By the time the Yorktown class carriers were laid down in the 1930s, the American Navy had absorbed the German lesson into the bones of its ships and the training of its crews. The Japanese took a different lesson from a different battle. May 27, 1905, the Tsushima Strait, between Japan and Korea. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's combined fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in what remains one of the most lopsided naval victories in modern history. The Russians lost 21 ships sunk and 7 captured. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. It was not just a victory, it was a vindication of everything the Japanese Navy believed about how wars at sea are won. Strike first, strike hard, destroy the enemy fleet in one decisive engagement before he can recover. Tsushima became the founding myth of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Every cadet at the Naval Academy at Etajima studied it. Every admiral measured himself against it. The battle validated the doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. One overwhelming engagement. Maximum offensive firepower concentrated at the decisive moment. The enemy fleet destroyed before it can recover. The Japanese naval theorist Tetsutaro Sato, sometimes called the Japanese Mahan, after the American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose work he studied obsessively, built an entire strategic framework around Tsushima. The idea was straightforward. Japan could not match the industrial output of the United States. It could not build as many ships. So it would build better ships, train better crews, and win the war in a single cataclysmic fleet action before American factories could replace their losses. This doctrine had consequences. If the war would be decided by one great battle, then every ship needed to hit as hard as possible. Offensive power, the size of the guns, the range of the torpedoes, the speed of the carriers, became the priority. Defensive capability, the ability to absorb damage and keep fighting, became secondary. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 made this worse. The treaty limited the total tonnage Japan could build. Every ton devoted to armor and damage control was a ton taken away from guns, speed, and aircraft capacity. Japanese naval designers squeezed their ships for maximum offensive punch within the treaty limits, and damage control suffered. This showed in the ships themselves. Japanese aircraft carriers used enclosed hangars that trapped gasoline vapors. They stored aviation fuel in tanks that were poorly isolated from the rest of the ship. They conducted fueling and arming operations inside those enclosed hangars, surrounded by volatile fumes. Their fire suppression systems were minimal. Their damage control parties were undermanned and poorly trained. On a comparable American carrier, one officer owned all damage control. Every sailor, from the cook to the signalman, was drilled in basic firefighting and flooding control. The Japanese were not. But in December 1941, none of this mattered yet, because on the morning of December 7, when 353 Japanese aircraft swept across Pearl Harbor and sank or damaged 18 American warships in 2 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had just delivered exactly the kind of devastating first strike that Kantai Kessen demanded. 8 battleships were hit, 5 were sunk or beached. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled before it could fight. Japanese pilots had proven they could project more striking power, more accurately, across greater distances, than anything the Western powers had imagined possible. In the months that followed, the victory seemed to confirm everything. The Japanese sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off Malaya, the first time in history that capital ships underway and actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power. They destroyed the Allied fleet at the Battle of the Java Sea. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the Western Pacific with a speed that stunned the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the peak of its power and had not yet lost a single capital ship in combat. Japanese naval officers, surveying the wreckage of Allied fleets from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, concluded what their doctrine had always told them: offensive power wins wars. The Americans had numbers. They did not have warriors. The Japanese had the finest carrier striking force on Earth, the Kido Butai, and it had not yet lost a ship. And here is the thing you need to hold on to, because it is what makes the rest of this story extraordinary. 5 months after Pearl Harbor, at a coral reef in the Central Pacific, the Japanese would send their best pilots to sink an American carrier. They would hit her with 3 bombs. They would set her on fire. They would report her destroyed. And 3 hours later they would watch her launch fighters. They would not be able to explain what they were seeing. Not because the Americans had built a stronger ship, but because the Americans had built a different kind of crew. What had changed? That is the question we have to answer. And the first piece of the answer did not arrive at Midway. It arrived 5 weeks earlier, in the Coral Sea, when an American carrier died from a wound she inflicted on herself. And from that death came a revolution. May 8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea. USS Lexington, one of the 2 largest carriers in the American fleet, a ship displacing over 36,000 tons with a crew of nearly 3,000 men, absorbs 2 torpedo hits and 3 bomb hits from Japanese aircraft. The damage is serious, but apparently survivable. Her crew goes to work. They control the fires. They shore the flooded compartments. The engineering department corrects the ship's list by counter-flooding. Within an hour, Lexington is making 25 knots and conducting flight operations as if nothing has happened. Her captain, Frederick Sherman, believes the ship will make it home. For nearly 2 hours, that belief seems justified. Then, at 12:47, deep inside the ship, in a compartment the damage control parties have not been able to reach, a spark from a motor generator ignites gasoline vapors leaking from aviation fuel lines ruptured by the torpedo hits. The explosion kills 25 men instantly and knocks out the forward damage control station. More explosions follow. The gasoline vapors, invisible and odorless, have been accumulating for hours in enclosed spaces no one checked. Within minutes, Lexington is beyond saving. She is abandoned and scuttled by American torpedoes that evening. Lexington did not die because the Japanese hit her too hard. She died because her own gasoline killed her. The aviation fuel system had no way to purge the vapor from ruptured lines. The damage control teams had no way to detect the gas before it reached an ignition source. The ship was designed to fight, not to survive fighting. The United States Navy looked at the loss of Lexington and did something the Imperial Japanese Navy, after its own catastrophic losses, would never do at the same speed or the same scale. The Americans treated the disaster as a classroom. Within weeks, the Bureau of Ships began compiling detailed war damage reports analyzing exactly what had gone wrong and distributing the findings to every ship in the fleet, to every damage control training school, and to every shipyard for immediate modifications. The reports created an institutional learning loop, a system for turning each ship's suffering into every ship's survival. And then came the firemen. Lieutenant Harold Burke had been the deputy chief of the New York City Fire Department before the war. Lieutenant Thomas Kilduff had been a firefighter in Boston. Both were Navy reservists, and both arrived at the Bureau of Ships with a message that the professional Navy officers had never heard from men who actually fought fires for a living. The Navy was fighting fires wrong. Burke and Kilduff introduced the fog nozzle, a device that turned a fire hose from a solid stream into a fine mist. The fog nozzle did not just throw water at a fire, it smothered it. The mist expanded into steam, displacing oxygen and cooling the surrounding air faster than a straight stream could. It was the standard tool of every big city fire department in America, and the Navy had never used one. The two firemen trained over 260 instructors who fanned out to firefighting schools at every continental naval base. Equipment flooded the fleet. Portable pumps called handy billies, light enough for 2 men to carry and powerful enough to feed a fire hose on their own. Gasoline-powered emergency fire mains, independent of the ship's main engineering plant, so that a crew could still fight fires even if the engine room was destroyed. Foamite systems for smothering fuel fires. Standardized hose couplings so that any hose from any ship could connect to any fitting on any other ship. And aboard Yorktown, a young machinist named Oscar Myers, the air fuel officer, built something that would save his ship and change the Navy forever. He designed a system to pump all aviation gasoline out of the topside fuel lines and back down into the tanks before battle, then flood those empty lines and tanks with carbon dioxide gas, creating an inert blanket that no spark could ignite. It was the direct opposite of what had killed Lexington. Where Lexington had left her fuel lines full and her vapor unchecked, Yorktown would go into battle with her fuel lines purged and her tanks blanketed in gas that could not burn. It worked. At the Battle of Coral Sea, Yorktown had taken a bomb that penetrated the flight deck, destroyed 6 compartments below, killed or wounded dozens of men, and ruptured fuel tanks. Her crew controlled the fires so quickly and patched the flight deck so cleanly that by the time she reached Pearl Harbor, the damage was mostly internal. But internal damage was still crippling. The original estimate was that repairs would take 90 days. Some assessments said 3 months. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew from codebreaking that the Japanese would strike Midway around June 4. He needed every carrier he had. When Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, Nimitz went down to Dry Dock No. 1 personally to inspect the hull. He turned to his repair officers and gave the order that became legend. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." After a long silence, the hull repair officer answered, "Yes, sir." Roughly 1,400 Pearl Harbor Navy Yard workers labored around the clock, welding plates, shoring frames, patching compartments, working in shifts that never stopped. Yorktown sortied in approximately 72 hours. Repairs that should have taken months were completed in 3 days. The Japanese, who believed they had sunk or crippled Yorktown at Coral Sea, expected to face only 2 American carriers at Midway. They would face 3. And aboard that hastily repaired ship, Oscar Myers' carbon dioxide purging system was ready. When Japanese dive bombers hit Yorktown at Midway with 3 bombs around midday on June 4, one of those bombs penetrated the flight deck, crashed through 4 decks, and exploded deep inside the ship, near the forward gasoline storage. On Lexington, a hit like that would have been the beginning of the end. On Yorktown, the carbon dioxide blanket held. Admiral Nimitz himself wrote in his after-action report that Yorktown, though hit by 3 bombs and set afire, had no gasoline fires, possibly because of the effective use of carbon dioxide in the gasoline system. Yorktown's crew put out the fires, patched the flight deck hole, relit the boilers, and within 2 hours had the ship making nearly 20 knots, with fighters launching from her deck. It was an act of collective seamanship that would have been remarkable under any circumstances. Under these circumstances, with bombs still falling across the fleet, and the enemy still in striking range, it was extraordinary. The damage control parties worked with drilled precision, each team in its assigned zone, each man knowing his task. They sealed ruptured compartments. They pumped out flooding. They ran new hose lines to replace the ones destroyed by the blasts. They splinted broken steam pipes and patched holes in the exhaust uptakes that had starved the boilers of draft. Within an hour and 10 minutes of the bomb hits, the engine room reported ready to make 20 knots or better. The Japanese torpedo bomber pilots who attacked her around 1440 that afternoon saw a carrier that appeared undamaged and fully operational. They reported to Admiral Yamaguchi that they were attacking what must be a second, undamaged American carrier. They did not realize they were looking at the same ship their comrades had set ablaze 3 hours earlier. The Japanese High Command concluded from these reports that they had crippled 2 American carriers that day. They had crippled one. She had simply refused to stay crippled. Now look at what was happening on the other side of that same ocean, on the same morning. At 10:22, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown hit 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, within 5 minutes of each other. The attack lasted barely 6 minutes. The bombs were devastating, but not because of the explosions alone. Each bomb hit ruptured aviation fuel lines, ignited aircraft loaded with gasoline and armed with torpedoes, and set off chain reactions of secondary explosions on hangar decks crammed with ordnance that had been pulled from storage during the chaotic rearming orders of that morning. The Japanese carriers had no carbon dioxide purging systems. Their enclosed hangars trapped the flames and the vapor. Their fire mains were wrecked by the initial blasts. Their damage control parties, small and undertrained, were overwhelmed in minutes. On Akagi, the flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo himself, a single bomb from Lieutenant Richard Best's dive bomber struck the midships elevator and exploded on the hangar deck among armed and fueled torpedo bombers. 2 near misses bracketed her hull. That single direct hit was enough. The fires reached the ordnance and the avgas. Within minutes, the hangar deck was a furnace. Flames shot out of the elevator openings. The flight deck buckled from the heat below. Nagumo had to be physically pulled from the bridge by his staff officers. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, leaving Captain Aoki with a ship that was already beyond saving. Akagi took 1 direct bomb hit. 1. Captain Taijiro Aoki, her commanding officer, told American interrogators after the war what happened next. He said, and these are his own words from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogation, that the ship did not sink from bombs. She was sunk by torpedoes from a Japanese destroyer the next morning. The engines were helpless, fire damage, could not navigate. So they gave up the ship. 1 bomb, and a ship carrying 1,400 men was abandoned to fire, not because the bomb was too powerful, because the fire was too uncontrolled. Kaga took about 4 direct hits. Fires ignited thousands of pounds of bombs, and torpedoes spread across her hangar deck. She burned for hours and sank that evening. Soryu took 3 hits and was engulfed within minutes. Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, was hit later that afternoon by dive bombers from Enterprise and burned through the night. 4 aircraft carriers. The core of the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier striking force the world had ever assembled. All 4 lost in a single day, not to a superior fleet, not to overwhelming numbers, to fire, to gasoline vapor, the damage control failures that an American crew on an American ship fighting the same battle on the same ocean had already solved. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps these stories visible to the audience that cares about them. If you have learned something so far, that button matters more than you might think. USS Yorktown was not an isolated case. She was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the Pacific for the next 3 years. A pattern in which American warships absorbed damage that should have destroyed them and kept fighting because their crews refused to let them die. USS Enterprise earned the nickname the Big E, and she earned it the hard way. She was damaged by the enemy on 6 separate occasions across the war, absorbing 13 direct hits and 3 near misses. The Japanese reported her sunk 6 different times. She was never sunk. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, 3 bombs hit her flight deck, and 4 near misses buckled her hull plates. 74 men were killed, 95 were wounded. Her damage control parties went to work immediately, patching holes, shoring bulkheads, fighting fires, and she steamed back to Pearl Harbor under her own power for repairs. At Santa Cruz 2 months later, she was hit twice more, lost 44 men, and kept fighting. She recovered aircraft from the sinking Hornet, even with her forward elevator jammed, and her flight deck scarred with bomb damage. She made the open sea, with welders' arcs still sparking on her deck, and air hammers still driving rivets into emergency patches. Enterprise survived the entire war. She was the most decorated ship in the United States Navy, and she survived because, on 6 separate occasions, her crew looked at catastrophic damage and decided, each man at his station, without waiting to be told, that the ship was going to live. But the supreme test of American damage control, the moment that proved the system was not just doctrine but culture, came on the morning of March 19, 1945, 50 miles off the coast of Japan. USS Franklin, an Essex-class carrier designated CV-13, was operating closer to the Japanese home islands than any American carrier had ever been. Her flight deck was loaded with 31 fueled and armed aircraft preparing for a strike. At 7:08 that morning, a single Japanese dive bomber broke through the cloud cover and dropped 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs onto Franklin's crowded flight deck. The first hit the flight deck among the armed and fueled planes. The second penetrated to the hangar deck. The explosions set off a chain reaction that no crew on any ship had ever faced at this scale. Armed bombs began detonating. Loaded torpedoes cooked off in their racks. Aviation gasoline from ruptured fuel tanks poured across the hangar deck in rivers of fire. Rockets streaked across the flight deck on their own, fired by the heat, and slammed into bulkheads or shot into the sky. The ammunition magazine threatened to explode, which would have broken the ship in half. The fires were so intense that paint on the hull blistered and peeled 50 feet below the flight deck. The ship lost all power, lost steering, lost communications, and began listing 13 degrees to starboard while drifting toward the Japanese home islands at the mercy of the current. As many as 807 men were killed and 487 wounded, though the figures vary by source. These were the worst casualties suffered by any American warship that survived the war, second only to USS Arizona, which did not survive. By every rational assessment, Franklin should have joined Arizona on the bottom. She did not. And the reason she did not is a story about individual men doing things no manual could have predicted, because no manual could have imagined the situation they were in. Father Joseph O'Callaghan was a Jesuit priest. He was the ship's Catholic chaplain. He had been aboard Franklin for 17 days. He had no damage control training. He had no military specialty beyond the spiritual care of the crew. When the bombs hit, O'Callaghan went to the flight deck. He organized firefighting parties. He led men to jettison live ammunition over the side by hand, picking up bombs and rockets that were hot to the touch and throwing them into the sea before they could detonate. He directed hose teams into burning compartments. He administered last rites to dying men while standing in pools of burning fuel. A famous photograph taken that morning shows him bending over a wounded sailor named Robert Blanchard, giving the last rites. Blanchard survived. He lived to the age of 90. O'Callaghan became the first chaplain in United States Navy history to receive the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Gary was a 43-year-old engineering officer, a prior enlisted man who had served over 2 decades in the Navy before earning his commission. When the explosions cut off escape routes below decks, Gary discovered roughly 300 men trapped in a smoke-filled mess compartment with no visible way out. He searched through the smoke until he found a passage, then led the men through it to safety. He went back and did it again, and again. Then he went to the number 3 fur room and personally raised steam in a boiler so that the ship could have power. His own description of the first blast was that they were knocked off their feet by a terrific explosion, and it seemed as though the ship had rammed into a mountain. Gary received the Medal of Honor. There were men on Franklin whose names did not make the official citations but whose actions kept the ship alive. The men who manned the one remaining gasoline-powered fire pump, the single emergency fire main that had not been destroyed by the explosions, and kept it running for 8 continuous hours. That pump was the reason the fires did not consume the entire ship. Without it, there was no water pressure, no hoses, and no way to fight back. The men who ran that pump did so knowing the fuel that powered it was the same kind of fuel that was burning all around them. In all, Franklin's crew earned 2 Medals of Honor, 19 Navy Crosses, 22 Silver Stars, 116 Bronze Stars, and 235 Letters of Commendation. The ship, still burning, was taken under tow, then raised her own steam, and began the voyage home under her own power. She steamed roughly 12,000 miles, from the western Pacific to Ulithi to Pearl Harbor, through the Panama Canal to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, arriving on April 28, 1945. She became known as the ship that would not die. Where did this come from? Not from a doctrine, not from a regulation. It came from the same place the fog nozzle and the handy billy pump came from. It came from a country that produced men like Harold Burke, a New York City fireman who walked into the Bureau of Ships and told the admirals they were fighting fires wrong. It came from a country that produced men like Oscar Myers, a ship's machinist who looked at the gasoline system and figured out how to make it safe on his own initiative. It came from a country that trained every sailor in basic firefighting, not because of some philosophical commitment to empowerment, but because the Americans had a practical culture that said if the ship is burning, everyone fights the fire. Cook, signalman, chaplain, yeoman. You grab a hose and you go. This was not just a military doctrine, it was a reflection of the civilian world these men came from. Volunteer fire departments in small towns across America, where every man in the community was expected to show up when the bell rang. Factory floors in Detroit and Pittsburgh, where a machinist who saw a problem did not file a report. He fixed the problem. Farm boys from Kansas and Iowa who had been repairing machinery since they were old enough to hold a wrench. The American sailor of 1944 was the product of a culture that distributed competence and initiative as widely as possible, that expected the man closest to the problem to solve the problem, and that did not draw a rigid line between the men who were supposed to think and the men who were supposed to follow. The Japanese Navy drew that line. The Imperial Japanese Navy was built on a caste system as rigid as any in the military world. Officers were trained at the Naval Academy at Etajima, an institution modelled on the British Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and they were separated from enlisted men by an unbridgeable gulf of status, education, and authority. Enlisted sailors were expected to obey. They were not expected to think. The knowledge of how to save a damaged ship was concentrated in the officer class, and even within the officer class, it was concentrated in a small number of specialists. When those specialists were killed, as they were in the fire and chaos of a bomb hit, the men around them did not know what to do, not because they were less brave. Japanese sailors fought with extraordinary courage. But courage without training, without tools, and without the cultural permission to improvise is not enough to keep a burning ship alive. The Japanese private sailor waited for instructions. The American private sailor grabbed a hose. If your father, or grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the Navy during the Second World War, on any ship, in any theater, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What ship? What battle? What did they remember? Those details, the ones that never made it into the official reports, are the actual history. They deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. To understand why the Japanese Navy lost ship after ship to fires that American crews routinely survived, you have to understand what was happening inside those Japanese ships and inside the institution that built them. The organizational difference was precise and measurable, and it began the moment a sailor reported aboard. On an American warship, every man who came aboard received basic damage control training as part of his indoctrination. He learned how to operate a fire hose. He learned how to use a portable pump. He learned how to shore a bulkhead with a wooden beam and a wedge. He learned the location of the nearest fire station, the nearest hose reel, the nearest damage control locker. He was assigned to a repair party based on where he worked and slept. so that wherever he was when the ship was hit, he knew which team he belonged to and where to go. The system ensured that damage control was not a specialty. It was a universal skill, like knowing how to swim or how to tie a knot. One trained officer, the assistant engineering officer, owned all damage control, top to bottom, bow to stern. He had dedicated teams assigned to 5 areas of the ship, each with its own equipment, its own communication lines, and its own authority to act without waiting for orders from the bridge. When a bomb hit and cut off communications, each team could operate independently, making its own decisions about where to fight fires and where to seal flooding, because each team understood the ship's overall condition well enough to prioritize on its own. On a Japanese warship, the system was fundamentally different. Damage control responsibility was divided between 2 officers who often did not coordinate. The chief engineering officer handled damage in the engineering spaces below the waterline. Damage above decks, on the flight deck, in the hangars, in the crew compartments, fell to the officer of the deck, who was often a junior lieutenant with minimal damage control training. His teams were not dedicated damage control specialists. They were men pulled from their regular duties, gunners and signalmen and aircraft handlers, who had little practice in fighting fires or shoring flooded compartments. They did not drill regularly, they did not have their own equipment pre-staged, and critically, they did not have the authority to act on their own judgment the way an American damage control party did. The Imperial Japanese Navy had made a fateful institutional decision early in the war. It chose to train officers in damage control, not enlisted men. In the American system, an ordinary seaman was expected to fight fires and shore bulkheads. In the Japanese system, the knowledge of how to save a ship was concentrated in a handful of officers. When those officers were killed in the first minutes of an attack, and they often were, the enlisted sailors around them were left without guidance, without training, and without the institutional permission to figure it out themselves. This organizational split meant that when a bomb hit a Japanese carrier and started fires on the hangar deck, while simultaneously rupturing fuel lines below the waterline, 2 different officers with 2 different chains of command were trying to manage a single catastrophe. Coordination was poor, confusion was common, and the men doing the actual work, the enlisted sailors manning the hoses and the pumps, had not been trained for the task. The design of Japanese carriers made everything worse. American carriers of the Essex class used open hangar decks. The sides of the hangar were not fully enclosed, which meant that gasoline vapors could vent into the open air, and burning aircraft could be pushed overboard. Japanese carriers used enclosed hangars, sealed on all sides. Gasoline fumes accumulated, fires fed on trapped oxygen, burning planes could not be jettisoned. The hangar became an oven. At Midway, this design flaw was catastrophic. When American bombs hit Kaga's flight deck, the explosions ruptured fuel lines and ignited aircraft on the enclosed hangar deck below. The fires detonated armed torpedoes and bombs that had been stacked in the hangar during the rearming chaos of that morning. The secondary explosions blew out the hangar walls, destroyed both fire mains, wrecked the emergency generator that powered the fire pumps, and disabled the carbon dioxide fire suppression system. Kaga's crew was left with no water, no foam, no gas suppression, and no power. They fought the fires with buckets. It was not enough. The doctrine that produced these ships had spent 40 years optimizing for one thing: the ability to deliver a knockout blow. Every design decision that increased offensive capability at the expense of survivability was consistent with the Kantai-Kessen philosophy. Build the ship to hit hard. Assume the enemy dies first. Do not plan extensively for the possibility that your ship gets hit, because in the decisive battle, speed and firepower will prevent that from happening. The Battle of Midway destroyed that assumption in 6 minutes, but it also destroyed something that could not be rebuilt. The most experienced carrier crews in the Japanese Navy went down with those 4 ships. The pilots and air crews lost at Midway were the men who had trained for years before the war, who had struck Pearl Harbor and ravaged the Indian Ocean, who represented an irreplaceable concentration of skill and experience. The maintenance crews, the ordnance handlers, the flight deck directors, and the damage control teams had accumulated thousands of hours of operational knowledge that existed only in their hands and their memories. When they died, the Japanese Navy could replace the aircraft eventually. It could build new carriers eventually. It could not replace the men, not in a year, not ever. The American Navy, by contrast, was expanding at a pace that would have been unimaginable before the war. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class fleet carrier roughly every 2 months. Each one came with a crew trained at the growing network of damage control schools that Burke and Kilduff had built. Each one carried the lessons of Lexington and Yorktown and every other damaged ship, distributed through the Bureau of Ships' War Damage Reports. The Americans were getting better at keeping ships alive, faster than the Japanese were getting better at sinking them. And here is where the parallel with damage control becomes most painful. The experienced damage control officers and petty officers who went down with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were never adequately replaced either. The Japanese Navy after Midway was filling its ships with younger, less experienced crews who had less training in every aspect of naval warfare, including the aspect that mattered most when the bombs started falling. 2 years after Midway, the consequences of this loss became visible in the most devastating way imaginable. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The carrier Taiho was the newest and most heavily armored carrier in the Japanese fleet. She displaced over 29,000 tons. She was the first Japanese carrier with an armored flight deck, 3 3/4 inches of steel over the most critical sections, designed specifically to survive the kind of bomb hits that had destroyed her predecessors at Midway. Her designers had studied every carrier loss in the war and built what they believed was an unsinkable ship. She was the flagship of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. She had been commissioned barely 3 months earlier. That morning, the American submarine Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at Taiho as she was launching aircraft. A Japanese warrant officer named Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho's deck, saw the torpedo wakes in the water and dove his aircraft into one of them, sacrificing his life to protect his ship. He destroyed 1 torpedo, but 1 hit. A single torpedo struck the starboard side forward. The torpedo ruptured aviation fuel tanks beneath the forward elevator pit. Gasoline and seawater mixed in the elevator well, and the mixture began producing vapors. The crew planked over the elevator opening with mess tables and benches, and Ozawa ordered flight operations to resume. The armored flight deck was intact. The ship could still make 33 knots. She seemed fine. Below decks, the damage control officer, a man with limited experience, made a decision that would kill his ship. He ordered the ventilation system opened to full power to disperse the gasoline fumes. On an American carrier, the doctrine learned from Lexington's death was the exact opposite. You do not ventilate gasoline vapor. You seal the space. You flood it with carbon dioxide. You smother the fumes. You never, under any circumstances, blow air through a compartment full of explosive gas. The Japanese damage control officer had not learned that lesson because his navy had not built the institutional learning system that would have taught it to him. The ventilation fans pushed the gasoline vapor out of the elevator pit and into every unsealed compartment on the ship. For 6.5 hours, Taiho steamed on, her crew unaware that the ship was filling with an invisible, explosive atmosphere. At 14:30, a spark from an electrical generator on the hangar deck found the vapor. The explosion was enormous. It heaved the armored flight deck upward and blew out the sides of the hull. Taiho went down within hours. Of a crew of roughly 2,150 men, approximately 1,650 were killed. 1 torpedo, 1 ventilation error, 1 ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, killed by her own damage control. Taiho was the most damning illustration of the gap, but she was not the only one. That same day, the veteran carrier Shokaku was torpedoed by the American submarine Kavala. Shokaku's crew had more experience than Taiho's. They had survived bomb damage at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. They had been through battle before, but the torpedoes ruptured her aviation fuel storage, and the resulting vapor explosions were beyond what even experienced crews could contain. Shokaku sank with 1,263 of her crew. There is an important exception that deserves mention, because it proves the point rather than contradicting it. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, the American carrier Hornet was hit by bombs, torpedoes, and 2 deliberate suicide dives by damaged Japanese aircraft. Her damage control teams could not save her. She was abandoned and eventually sunk by Japanese destroyers. On the same day, the Japanese carrier Shokaku took 3 to 6 heavy bomb hits, and her experienced damage control crews saved her. Shokaku survived because her crew had the training, the experience, and the time to act. The lesson is exactly the point of this entire investigation. Damage control is a skill. It is a learned, institutional, practiced skill. Where Japanese crews had the training and the preparation, their ships survived. The tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy is that it never made that skill universal. It never distributed the knowledge to every ship and every sailor the way the Americans did after Lexington. 2 more ships need to be named, because their survival confirmed the pattern one final time. USS Bunker Hill, an Essex-class carrier, was hit by 2 kamikaze aircraft within 30 seconds of each other off Okinawa on May 11, 1945. With fueled and armed aircraft on deck, the fires were immediate and catastrophic. 396 men were killed or went missing. 264 were wounded. These were the second worst casualties of any carrier that survived the war. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Joseph Carmichael kept the boilers and engines running, despite as many as 125 of the 500 men in his engine rooms being killed or wounded, according to Navy records. Captain George Seitz credited the men who kept the boilers going and the pressure in the fire mains. Bunker Hill steamed to Ulithi at 20 knots and then home under her own power. USS Laffey, a destroyer designated DD-724, was attacked off Okinawa on April 16, 1945, by approximately 22 Japanese aircraft over 80 minutes. She was struck by 6 kamikaze planes and 4 bombs. 32 men were killed. 71 were wounded out of a crew of 336. Her superstructure was wrecked. Her aft engine room was flooded. Fires burned in multiple compartments simultaneously. When her assistant communications officer asked Commander Frederick Beckton whether they would have to abandon ship, Beckton replied that he would never abandon ship as long as a single gun would fire. His gunners shot down 9 attackers. His damage control teams fought fires on a deck that was being hit again and again, putting out 1 fire only to have another start from the next kamikaze impact minutes later. Ensign Robert Thompson left his station in the Combat Information Center to lead a fire party on the main deck and was killed by a strafing run. He received a posthumous Navy Cross. The naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote of Laffey that probably no ship had ever survived an attack of the intensity that she experienced. Laffey survives today as a museum ship at Patriots Point in South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks and see where the kamikazes hit. The scars are still there. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the United States military launched one of the most comprehensive intelligence operations of the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey sent teams of officers across Japan to interrogate surviving naval commanders and examine Japanese ships, technology, and doctrine. Among the documents produced was the report of the Naval Technical Mission to Japan, including a 17-page assessment designated S-84N, titled Japanese Damage Control. That report, and the interrogations that accompanied it, confirmed what American sailors had been witnessing for 3 years. The Japanese knew they had a problem. After Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued new doctrine giving damage control greater emphasis. They tried to shift fueling and arming operations from the enclosed hangars up to the flight deck, where burning aircraft could at least be pushed overboard. They reorganized their air groups. They even filled the voids around the aviation fuel tanks of the carrier Shinano with 2,400 tons of concrete, a desperate measure that did not save her when American submarine torpedoes found her in November 1944, just 10 days after commissioning. But the reforms were too little, too late, and too shallow. Japanese shipyards could not replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway until early 1945, by which time the Americans had commissioned more than a dozen new Essex-class fleet carriers. American factories produced 5 times as many aircraft as Japan in 1943 alone. The material gap was enormous, but the human gap, the damage control gap, was even more decisive. The interrogation transcripts are revealing not for what the Japanese officers admitted, but for what they could not explain. Captain Aoki of the Akagi described his ship being abandoned after what he believed were 2 bomb hits, though modern forensic scholarship by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully has since established that only 1 bomb actually struck the carrier. It did not matter whether the number was 1 or 2. What mattered was that the fires could not be controlled. Officers from Kaga described about 4 direct hits, whose fires ignited aircraft and ammunition and resulted in the sinking of the ship that afternoon. The pattern across the interrogations is identical: a few hits, then fire, then loss. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was present on Akagi's bridge at Midway, wrote after the war that the bomb damage to Akagi would not normally have been fatal to a carrier of that size. What was fatal, he wrote, were the induced explosions of fuel and munitions that devastated whole sections of the ship. Compare that with Franklin: 2 bomb hits, 31 armed and fueled aircraft detonating on her flight deck, more than 700 dead, and the ship sailed 12,000 miles home under her own power. Or Enterprise: 13 direct hits across the war, reported sunk 6 times by the Japanese, and she never sank. Or Yorktown at Midway: 3 bombs, fires controlled in under 2 hours, back to 20 knots, and the Japanese could not even tell she had been hit. The difference was not in the ships. American carriers were not dramatically more armored than their Japanese counterparts. The Essex class had no armored flight deck. The difference was in the 1,200 men aboard each ship. It was in the cook who knew how to operate a fire hose. It was in the yeoman who knew how to shore a bulkhead. It was in the machinist named Oscar Myers who built a carbon dioxide purging system because he saw a problem and fixed it himself. It was in the chaplain named Joseph O'Callaghan who had no training in damage control and led firefighting parties on a burning flight deck because someone had to, and the someone was him. Every name in this investigation is real. Every event is documented. The confusion on Hiryu's bridge was real. Admiral Yamaguchi and his officers truly believed they had crippled 2 different American carriers at Midway because they could not imagine that a ship hit by 3 bombs could be fighting again 3 hours later. That failure of imagination was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of experience. They had never seen a crew save a ship like that because their own crews had never been given the tools, the training, or the organizational structure to do it. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi was real. He went down with Hiryu that night, choosing to die with his ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki was real. His interrogation testimony about Akagi's death is in the public record. Machinist Oscar Myers was real. His carbon dioxide system saved Yorktown and became standard across the fleet. Father Joseph O'Callaghan was real. He served 17 days aboard a ship he had never been on before and walked into an inferno because he believed it was his duty. Lieutenant Donald Gary was real. He led 300 men out of the dark and then went below to light a boiler so his ship could move. Harold Burke and Thomas Kilduff were real. They were city firemen who taught the United States Navy how to fight fires. Commander Frederick Beckton was real. He held Laffey together through 6 kamikaze hits by refusing to consider the possibility that his ship could die. Most of the men who saved those ships are not in the history books. They were the ones running the handy billy pumps for 8 hours straight, the ones dragging hoses through flooded passageways, the ones shoring bulkheads with wooden beams while the deck buckled under their feet. They were boiler technicians and electricians and aviation ordnance men and mess stewards. They came from places like Cranford, New Jersey, and upstate New York and small towns in Ohio and farms in Oklahoma. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as men doing a job. The job happened to be keeping their ship from sinking, and they did it because no one in their lives had ever taught them that a problem was somebody else's to fix. The Japanese Navy built the sharpest sword in the Pacific. The American Navy built the crew that could take a hit from that sword and keep coming. The sword won battles. The crew won the war. And the men who swung the sword, brave as they were, skilled as they were, never understood how the men on the other side kept getting up. The answer was never in a manual. It was in the hands of every sailor who picked up a hose, sealed a valve, shored a beam, and refused to let his ship go down. That was the secret. There was no secret. There was just a ship full of men who had been raised, long before they ever put on a uniform, in a country that had taught every one of them that when something is broken, you fix it. You do not wait for someone to tell you to fix it. You do not file a report. You do not look for the specialist. You fix it. And when the fire is out, and the water is pumped, and the deck is patched, and the boiler is lit, you sail the ship home. If this investigation gave you something to think about, consider subscribing. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men on ordinary ships who, at one moment in the war, decided that the situation required something, and that the someone who had to do it was them. They were not admirals. They were not strategists. They were cooks and machinist mates and chaplains and boiler tenders who grabbed a hose and went toward the fire. And they deserve to be remembered not for the ships they served on, but for the thing about them that the Japanese, in the end, could never quite explain. They would not let their ships die, and nobody had to tell them not to.